Colonel, what business is it of the American government in this border dispute between Ukraine and Russia, which has now gotten all out of proportion?
Well, the only real business we have, frankly, is in finding a way to avoid the kind of conflict that we're now in. We have a permanent interest in essentially preventing war from breaking out on the European continent. In fact, after 1991-92, NATO really existed in the minds of most of its members to prevent another war in Europe. So from that standpoint, I think we had an interest in that. Obviously, we've done the opposite. We seem to have done everything in our power to bring on conflict, which is tragic.
Has the United States, either by the introduction of financial resources or military assets or the imposition of sanctions on Russian industries and banking institutions, made this war worse, longer, bloodier, more violent, produced more deaths?
Oh, I think so. I don't think there's any question about that. And I think that's still the intention. And I had hoped that there would be an interest now in finding some sort of way to arrange a ceasefire and then hammer out details of a larger agreement. But I don't see any evidence for that at all. In fact, I see evidence for the opposite. If you look at the members of both parties, the so-called uniparty, everyone is screaming for blood. And it's not difficult to discern their real interest, which is in regime change in Moscow, which I think is lunacy, and it's also an unattainable objective.
What's the objective of NATO? Not their stated objective, but their real objective. Is that regime change in Moscow?
Yeah, I think so. I think you've got to go back to the late 90s. Once the Clinton administration took over and was in full swing, we see people like Madeleine Albright, who are challenging General Powell, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs, to use American military power to achieve goals. She was by no means a lone ranger. There's a whole coterie of people from that era, they're still with us now, who concluded that the victory in 1991 over the Iraqis demonstrated that there was really no one else left standing, and we could dominate pretty much anybody we wanted to with our military power.
And so, notwithstanding the promise of Jim Baker under George H.W. Bush that NATO would never move eastward, Clinton moved it radically eastward to the point where it subsumed former Warsaw Pact members.
Well, of course, but to be fair, I'm not sure President Clinton was ever terribly interested. He certainly was not a student of European affairs, didn't understand Europe at all. I'm not sure he knew much about the Soviet Union or Russia, for that matter. So I don't think he paid a great deal of attention, and essentially turned foreign policy over to this collection of people that we now refer to as globalist elites. People who are interested in open borders, denationalizing Europe, denationalizing the United States. They're in control again. They really never gave up control completely after George W. Bush was elected. Effectively, the same people came in and continued the policies that had emerged in the late 1990s. So remember that when we became involved in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Bosnia-Herzegovina rapidly became about dislodging Milosevic and his government from power. Initially, they were seen as a legacy of communism, not without some judgment that was accurate, but they misjudged the larger picture. It had less to do with communism, more to do with nationalism. So they saw him as a leader they had to remove, and the Kosovo Air Campaign presented itself as yet another opportunity. And the opportunity unfolded in ways that people didn't understand. They grossly underestimated the Serbs, their staying power, but ultimately they managed to persuade Yeltsin in Moscow to abandon the Serbs. And that sent a whole range of new forces into action that offended the Russians, angered the Russians. The Russians began saying that, who's next on the menu? And, the stories about Iraq and Afghanistan. Everything was about toppling the government and then installing something new that was theoretically democratic, for the purpose of advancing this so-called globalist agenda, which herded everyone into some global version of the European Union and increasingly a global version of NATO, all designed to extend the power and the influence of the United States and its ruling elites.
One of those globalists, I think you'll agree with me, is now the Secretary of State of the United States, Antony Blinken. What do you think he's advising President Biden to do? I mean, do they want to drag NATO and thus American troops into this? Do they not see how close they become when they have American military materiel 15 miles into Poland, almost tempting the Russians to attack it?
Well, remember, Judge, that over the last several years, I would go back certainly to the early part of this century, we began conducting exercises in the Baltic with U.S. naval and air power and even ground forces only 50 nautical miles from St. Petersburg. This has been going on for some time. We began conducting exercises right on the border of Poland and Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, in close proximity to Russia. So the Russians have been watching this for some time. That's one of the reasons they seized Crimea, was because they didn't want it to become a NATO naval base. And they were confident, based on our behavior, that that was inevitable if they didn't do something to stop it. I think they thought that that would warn us off. Now we have a government that has taken the position until quite recently that the Russians would never act. They would never dare to attack Ukraine, even though it was patently obvious to those of us that have been watching this business since about 2007, that was inevitable. For instance, the current CIA director, when he was ambassador in Moscow, wrote a memorandum talking about the Russians actually mean what they're saying. There is a red line, and we'd better not cross it. And his point was, at the time, Burns, that we were crossing it, that we were going to make some sort of military action in Ukraine inevitable by our behavior. Well, we've done that. We don't bother to talk about it because that doesn't fit the current narrative, that the unprovoked attack by the evil Putin is the source of all the problems in Europe and Ukraine. But, you know, there's a narrative that has been built that is widely embraced by the mainstream media, that's been carefully fabricated, designed to justify essentially whatever we want to do. But they were wrong. The Russians went in when they said they would not. They are wrong now if they believe that we can continue to push over the border into Ukraine, not just military equipment and military assistance, but also U.S. military personnel in any way, or NATO personnel in any way, without provoking an all-out war with Russia. So you're right. We are much closer to a direct confrontation with the Russian state and its military power than the people in Washington realize. It's back to this thing. They seem to think Russia is Iraq. That's their theory. They don't understand Russia is not Iraq.